I'll just open up with a question. What does conscious mean to you, and how does that show up?
Sure, I can start. Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Matt. So conscious, from my perspective, is a few things. When we look at investing in entrepreneurs, investing in founders, we're investing in people. So we're also investing in ideas, great ideas, potential, but it's particularly the people that we care about, because those are the individuals who have to see this thing to fruition, whatever it is. So when we look at consciousness in terms of our founders, we're looking for people who are like sponges. That's kind of the way we describe them internally. Individuals who are soaking up the world around them, who are really learning, who are becoming better versions of themselves, and who are aware that there's so much that they can do to develop themselves, which is a little bit contrary to what we think of this sort of bravado come out and, oh, I know everything I'm doing, and this confidence. It's not a lack of confidence and support of what you're doing, but it's really that sort of, hey, I believe in what I'm doing, but I also know that I have a long ways to go.
Oh, wow. This is one of the cardinal questions. What is consciousness, right?
What's the meaning of life, Tim? And how can everyone find it here?
Yeah, for me, the journey has been just ever deepening and nuanced awareness. It ties in with a lot of spiritual practice as well. One framework that I've been working with from a wonderful coach, Joe Hudson, in the Bay Area, that many of us train with. His framework is VIEW, which is vulnerability, impartiality, empathy, and wonder. I do like those 4 vectors. But for me, it's just been trying to get really, really, really aware and honest with myself about agendas and energies. And then the same with, I guess, everything in life. There's that saying, how you do one thing is how you do everything. But can that infuse everything from how you show up to how you invest to how you build things to how you are in relationship with yourself and others? So it's just that great awareness and understanding. And that's led me to this feeling of, nothing's inherently good or bad. It's just what is the intention and energy you wield with, right? Oh, now we're both fans of Conscious Leadership Group, right? I learned from there, nothing is good or bad there too, with even like a behavior, for as long as you powerfully choose it. It's fine to be Donald Trump if you powerfully choose it, right? So it's like, I want to be an asshole, I'm good at it, and I powerfully choose it. But then you're clean, you're not performing, you're not virtue signaling, you're not, hiding in those things. And that's one of the biggest challenges. Unconsciousness, I think, is when you're ignoring something or denying it, but pretending it's something else. And now that consciousness and spirituality has become the new hipsterism, sometimes we have a lot of performative virtue signaling around it, and that kind of hypocrisy is what I think really rubs people the wrong way. I'm an impact investor, I'm greenwashing this, and I support ESGs, and that sort of thing, when maybe we're playing the same game as before. So it's just that clean relationship with how we do anything and our real energy behind it.
I find it interesting, a lot of folks, when they come to fundraise, say, how should I show up? Right? How should I act for the VC to get money? And my comment is, act yourself. I always tell my entrepreneurs, if you're not integrated, i.e. you're the same person everywhere you show up, you're disintegrating, right? And I think authenticity is probably the most powerful thing you can do. So also think about how exhausting it is to be just one person. How many here are multiple people? And how many times you get confused when you say, okay, which person's supposed to show up now? And then that person gets mad at the other person who showed up a different way in the other meeting, right? So I think that is really important. What do you trade off? And why does this matter now to approach life this way? You notice I said life, not entrepreneurship. It's the same.
That's a really good question too, is do we have to trade anything off with it? I kind of think to the world of impact investing, and there's always been this, maxim that if you want to be impactful, you're going to have to give up maximum returns. And maybe sometimes it is true. I don't know that always has to be true, but historically there's been an aspect like that. there's a saying often bandied about in the private equity world is that smart money follows no values or principles. It just goes where returns are the maximum. And that can be great. And in Silicon Valley, I did 22 years in early stage venture capital, and we worshiped at the church of growth at any cost. Hyperscale, break things, move fast, ask for forgiveness later. And I think we paid a pretty terrible price for it. And that's why now, 22 years later, I'm really looking at revisiting, all of those precepts that we had, and I don't want to worship at that church anymore. There was a moment, I think 5 or 6 years ago, when I said to my partners, guys, I no longer want to look at consumer deals that have free ad-based business models because I just don't think it's the right ethical fit. I'm not at peace with myself for that because I've been in too many board meetings with that business model where we literally engineer for addiction. And I realized I'm not serving my customers in the right way. My customers, advertisers, are diametrically opposed to the interests of my end users. And, it was tough. It was a tough discussion because it was an ethical one. And I said, I'm going to miss out on TikTok and all these other things, which will probably be the biggest returners of all. But I can't live with those values. So I think that's part of what maybe being a conscious capitalist is just being really aware of the values and how that translates into the business models and the types of entrepreneurs that you want to work with. So for me, there was a trade-off. I personally believe modern current capitalism optimizes for sociopaths in many ways as leaders. And I don't want to behave in that way. And so, I'm not willing to go to the very last inch of negotiating the hardest to get the maximum return.
Yeah.
Yeah, echo the kudos on that. I think there may be trade-offs, and it's, we're in privileged positions when we can choose when to make those trade-offs and when we can't. And I think it's important to acknowledge that privilege. I do work for a fund that focuses on mission investing, although that's not our primary goal necessarily. So we still do about an 85% for-profit investing, but we do expect that companies will have some sort of mission driven component to what they do. So it's certainly something that we look at. Now, as it comes to what are we trading off, I guess if I look at venture today versus 15 years ago, I think the founders that we're seeing are a lot different today than what we were seeing before. But I also think generationally, folks that we're seeing come into business are different and have a different set of expectations and dreams and hopes for the world. It's not enough just to put food on the table, right? You want to be doing it in an ethical way, in a sustainable way. People are caring about the future. So while there may be some trade-offs in the short term, I do believe that in the long term, these are things that will actually balance out. And to be a conscious entrepreneur or a conscious investor and start from that point today, in the future, when that's sort of where we need to be in order to kind of separate from the AIs of the world, as we were talking about earlier, Tim, these are their long-term plans to put us in a better position, which might be a short-term trade-off, but it's not an all-or-nothing trade-off.
Yeah. And I think it's good. I think, Tim, you hit the nail on the head here when you use the word intentional. Like when I talk to my entrepreneurs, I say, yes, conscious has been usurped in many ways to greenwash and whatnot. But I say, are you intentional about what you're doing, right? Because if you're not intentional, Darwin will be. Right? And eventually Darwin will show you exactly where you should have been focused. And the example I use is I borrows from the world of Lyme disease. I have a kid with Lyme disease, and it's, every day we're like, okay, you have 10 spoons of energy. Where do you want to spend them? And I said, that's no different from an entrepreneur. And I was trying to connect what seems to be the right thing with actual competitive advantage. Like hope's not a strategy in venture. The idea of Jesus takes the wheel seems not to work so well. And so I said is like, if you lose 2 spoons, because you're just not aware of your own triggers and shadows, you're down to 8. Now, if you have a firm that's not intentional and people who want to be right and blame game and gossip and all these kinds of things that CLG goes hard after, right, in the 15 commitments of conscious leadership, you're taking, drama takes another 3 or 4. Well, shit, now you're down to 5 spoons in the most Darwinian of competitive worlds. And let's throw in some really good triggers from your board. Get a couple of unconscious VCs in there to create some drama. Now you're down to 3. Who in the hell came up with a model that you want to have 3 spoons of energy and focus in the most Darwinian competitive of parts of the world, right? And so if you can just slowly but surely through just intentional practice, start to claw back those spoons and get as close to 10 as possible and focus all of them on delighting your customer, building product, and focusing on culture. I mean, that would be to me, that is the perfect organization at that point. And I would not want to compete against that firm at the end of the day. And that's why John Mackey killed Safeway, right? And that's why everyone's really interested in consciousness. Is like, oh shit, that actually works. So, where have you seen unconscious behavior have disastrous results? And what advice would you give to entrepreneurs here to say, hey, this might be going on here?
One quick one is, again, the most unconscious tenet to me is just scale at any cost, right? And also the desire to build a unicorn. I don't know when that happened. I swear to God, I think it was like 10 years ago. I don't know, maybe it was like
Damn, Eileen
when
Lee.
Andreessen came out and started making PR and all these things such a key part of venture capital, which, by the way, it wasn't. When I started in it 22 years ago, a lot of the best investors didn't blog or say a whole lot. They just wanted to highlight founders, right? But then as money became a commodity, it became a marketing business, and it just really turned VCs into just salesmen of capital. And at that point, then it was all about selling. My money's greener than yours, and I'm more helpful, this, that, and the other. But it was performative, ultimately, in many ways. And then we created the whole mythos of being a unicorn. Valuations aren't real. Exits are, as well as the impact you have, I think, on your customers. But it just became an ego game, right? And so the most unintentional thing in the world is if a founder says, I want to create a unicorn. That's almost like an author coming to you and saying, I don't care what kind of book I write. I just want to be a New York Times bestseller. That's the opposite of having a really deep why and purpose of what you do, right? Unfortunately, that's driven by a lot of times the agenda that comes with money. Money is just energy, and it carries with it agendas and intentions and expectations. You want to match those expectations with the values that you want to build. A lot of times us VCs have to follow that pressure from the limited partners that we take our money from. Sometimes all they care about is IRR, fast returns, as big as possible. So thank goodness for the organizations that Lisa work at, where that money comes with deeper intention and purpose and a deeper why beyond just that one variable. What's your return on capital in a certain time frame, right? Because if that's the game you're playing, then of course you're just going to try to scale anything as fast as possible, right?
Yeah, I think another place where I see this on the inside happening a lot with CEOs and not being conscious is not bad intention. So it's still good intention, but oftentimes I see this where CEOs might not be setting boundaries, or they might not be willing to have difficult conversations with people. And what happens is, well, for those of us who were here yesterday, it was a great session hearing Vlada talk about, how hard it is when you want to be liked and you want to be successful. So maybe you delay some of the hard conversations, maybe you kind of push things off. And as we've seen in the last couple of years with the macro situation, there's been so much outside of control of the hands of CEOs, founders, anyone involved in business at this point. But I feel that I've seen a lot of CEOs kind of dig themselves in a hole where they've made promises that they can't keep, or they've not been honest about and transparent about what's happening to the degree that they can. I mean, you can't always share everything with your entire team. But what happens is then you sort of break this trust internally. And as soon as that trust internally is broken, then the next time you have to communicate a difficult message, it's just coming from a different place. So I think of conscious... I lost my mic. Oh, thanks, Tim. So I think of consciousness as also being how you show up in the day-to-day with your team and being mindful of that outside of the fundraise, but actually how you're behaving as a leader.
It's very intentional, very conscious of you. You realize the microphone wasn't working. Very aware. I like that symbolism of that. Thank you. So consciousness has a whole host of superpowers that we were talking about earlier, right? Around vulnerability, etc. What are some of those superpowers you think? Like when someone is just like in flow, you have that conscious leader, the competition's in a lot of trouble, the team is rallied behind them. What are they doing? What are some of these superpowers, these characteristics that we were talking about earlier?
I can jump into this one. I think number one, hands down, is empathy. I think empathy is such a superpower, and it's something that, because we're human, I feel like we all expect, oh, of course, I have this in me. And I do think we all have the capacity. But what I think now, as I'm learning more about empathy and how it works, is that there's an inverse relationship between empathy and power. So think about that for a second. Whether it's your board member or whether you as the CEO, you're in a position of power. It's really, really difficult to walk in the shoes of your team or people who are working for you without practicing conscious empathy, without really building your internal capability for doing that. Again, empathy isn't permission or, you can do whatever you want, everything is okay. Empathy is really being there. It's that sitting, it's that listening, it's that acknowledging. I think that's such a powerful skill that we as investors need to have, and you also need to have it with your teams. And those are the most powerful leaders that I work with.
Oh, I love that. I think we got that working. Yeah, I would agree with that. I also look a lot at sort of consciousness is about also a lot of shadow work and understanding, those blind spots of yours. So back to that notion of awareness. One of my favorite questions to ask founders is, do you know your core wound? How does it show up in your life? What have you done to integrate it? And it's the thing I'm always asking myself, which is the ongoing personal growth work as well. And I just realized that, wow, all that spiritual work is also my professional work. And it, again, how you do anything is how you do everything. And it infuses all of that. And that's why I often, will encourage founders not just to do professional coaching, but even do conscious relating classes, because how you show up as a partner probably is how you show up as a boss and a teammate as well. It all ties together, right? So that work is super key. And like founders that are really conscious have the superpower of that deep awareness of, I know my blind spots. I know the kind of people I want to build on my team that cover those blind spots. I know I get triggered. I know how to take a moment and respond versus react, all those sorts of things.
It's interesting having been in this business now 28 years, and so I always just run it against that screen. And so I was just kind of going through the list where you talked about empathy, vulnerability, candor, open-heartedness, compassion, generosity, optimism, hard work, team focus. These are all the superpowers, and there are a bunch of others beyond that. I can't think of a single company where if the CEO brought all of those out in mass, it wouldn't be the Avengers. Right? I can't think of a situation where and we're roadkill, right? Just the opposite. But yet ego comes creeping in, starting at age 3. Our parents want the best from us. You have to survive. You have to whatever. So it's from the best intent. But we're trained to be below the line, not to die from a primal perspective. As a result, these things are incredibly dangerous if your mindset is below the line. But when you get above the line and suddenly you can see the whole purview, you're like, shit, why wasn't I doing this before, right? And the nice thing about venture is we don't get to see, I've probably seen 20,000 business plans over my career. I've invested in 85 companies. And so I can actually say, I know, right? I don't guess. A lot of people are like, well, I have my one company or my 2 companies. So it's incredibly powerful. What I'd love to do now, if we could, if people want to come up with questions and be nice to us, please, ask the VCs. Please come up and let's have some dialogue.
First of all, I just want to say how refreshing it is to hear that from VCs, because usually as entrepreneurs, we hear the opposite all the time. We hear, oh, you have to embody this persona that sounds like so-and-so when you're pitching your investors. So hearing that from you is awesome, so thank you. So on that line, when you have entrepreneurs that are getting that type of feedback from other VCs and they're, having to pitch their next round and there's all this expectation from them, how do you help them navigate that?
Thank you. That's a great question. Me personally, in my experience, it was trying to help identify follow-on investors that would match the energy. of those founders. And what I mean by that is, if they were still figuring things out and they wanted investors that could help, then oftentimes they would want the vulnerability, and as opposed to coming in with that face of like, I'm crushing it, I have all the answers. There are some investors where the most trust building thing you can do is say, I don't know X, Y, and Z. I have a hypothesis, A, B, and C, and I'm going to test it with 1, 2, and 3. That is just awesome, because sometimes I don't know, but here's how I want to test it is the greatest answer of all, as opposed to I've got this, I have an airtight answer, and try to appear bulletproof. But again, that is also matching up with the right kind of investors as well. So again, that energetic alignment is a fit. And I guess one caveat I want to put on this too, I was having conversations with some friends earlier that venture capital isn't the only funding source, and sometimes it's not the right funding source. A lot of times we call it rocket fuel, but rocket fuel can explode things that aren't meant to go that fast. So the good news is there's more types of funding these days and more types of structures. So traditional venture capital is kind of like the devil but it's not always the devil you want to be married to. So yeah.
I think it's great that you're asking this question, first of all. It's been my experience that founders, at least they look at Flourish Ventures as a brand to have on their cap table that looks like the impact. And now they want to go with the Tiger Globals of the world, or what have you, to be just the infusion of cash. So we leave a lot of this to the entrepreneur. I think honestly, a lot of this tends to fall on the shoulders of the individual who's raising money and what their strategy is for that. A few things I would suggest is to really be interviewing your potential investors the same way that they're evaluating you. Which is this a person you want to be in relationship with for a long time? Because you're going to be. What are they interested in? Are they interested in you as a person? Or are they just interested in your business? How does their time seem to you? Do they have time to meet with you? I really try to press our entrepreneurs, especially when we're doing follow-on rounds and they're looking to bring in new investors into the syndicate. It's like, be choosy. Really, you have much more power than you think in choosing, when you have a great business, who it is that you want to have coming along for the ride. So to be true to yourself.
I would say that, how earlier I was talking about the most important thing you can be is integrated, be authentic. The best pitches are the storytellers, and the best stories are the origin stories. And the best origin stories have emotion and moment. Who here wasn't on the verge of tears, if not, quote, crying, not crying, when Keith was talking? Right? So I think that Keith was a classic example of storytelling. And I don't know, yes, you may have some VCs who will say, well, you don't seem vicious enough or whatever, but you can be viciously authentic at the end of the day. And then, by the way, in terms of flipping the questions, what are your top values? Is it empathy? Is it this? Is it that? And just ask the VC point blank, tell me a time you were empathetic. More importantly, tell me a time where it actually cost you to be empathetic and you still were. Because we did a summit on culture, and the RX Bar founder said a value is only a value if you're willing to lose revenue over it. Right? And I thought, shit, that is the clearest perspective of keep it off the coffee mug that I've ever heard. Right? So, but by the way, it's a false duality, and that's ego kicking in, and it's you being pulled below the line. But once you get into the flow of the pitch, you're going to find that most VCs in general will resonate with authenticity. In Tim's comment, if you don't know, just say, I don't know, and let me get back to you tomorrow. They love that. Our biggest fear is you don't know your blind spots and you implode the company. So best thing you can do is just say it.
Hi. Well, thank you for doing this. I think we all know the numbers concerning women and BIPOC entrepreneurs. So question number one is, how do we change that? And then number two, if you've had experience with BIPOC or women founders, do they need different treatment or different ways of you showing up than say white male founders?
I can take this. Yeah, thank you for that question. And it came up yesterday, I think, when Clarence was talking as well. And there certainly are incredibly depressing statistics around money and where it goes. And this is something that at Flourish we've been very aware about and conscious of, and really trying to have some little piece of influence there. So we actually created an accelerator. Now this is in Africa because we do, a lot of our work is in emerging markets as well. But we found that in Africa, for instance, entrepreneurs who are women, who are in tier 2 or tier 3 cities, who don't have the same networks, are much less likely to get funded even though they have amazing ideas. So we created basically an accelerator called Matica, where it's bringing together women, it's bringing together communities so that we can start to build the skills that it takes to break into that space. We're starting to think about that in the US as well and what that would look like. I think there's still more research to be done. We've recently done a poll of several thousand entrepreneurs who are women and BIPOC, and trying to understand what are the things that are important to you in your startup journey, what would have been helpful, what did you miss out on, what did you need more of, and trying to understand that, because I think we have to come from a place of listening and understanding first and find out before we just start throwing money at things like what is really meaningful. And it's not just what, maybe one or two say, but the whole larger ecosystem of entrepreneurs. So I don't really have any good answers, although I will say that pitch deck training, having mental health support, having coaches, having mentors, those are all disproportionately, I think, more valuable to underrepresented founders.
And I'd add to that, adding more BIPOC and women investors with actual decision and check writing authority into investment groups is really key to that. And it's starting to happen. I mean, there's been moments where it's been sort of performative diversity, and you can always tell if it's real if they have actual check writing capability and decision making power, as opposed to, oh, we hired a junior analyst and she's a woman of color. Like, that's, to me, check the box.
I also think that there's a little bit of a false duality at the end of the day, which is half my CEOs are women. And it wasn't because I got up one morning and said, hey, this is what I want. It's because I grew up with a single mom who was Mensa smart. Her brother ran one of the major investment banks, and she was always smarter. And I just remember, what the fuck? Like, right? It screws me over on dating too, by the way. But what I think is also is lean into your strengths. What I found that like Honest Company would not have been Honest Company if a dude had started it, right? Women are great storytellers because they dig deep into emotion. They're authentic in how they convey it. They have an amazing network, right? If Honest was there, like, I'm on a mission, a bunch of guys go out for beers, say, hey, good, you go. Women are like, oh my God, let me tell you, I get my friend here, right? And suddenly, boom, you go viral. I find it so joyous to have them as CEOs, less drama, and less blind spots into the wall. And so I think oftentimes people view it as, this is something we need to do. I think that my female entrepreneurs probably outperform my male entrepreneurs, in all honesty. So I just think the first thing is we have to just like conscious versus regular investing, it's just all investing. I had a CTO, she's like, I'm a female CTO. I'm like, no, you're a fucking CTO, right? That kind of thing. And then yes, the best way to do this is get more women into venture and then fund more women, because then they'll hire more women and then they'll be role models and the flywheel goes.
I run a fractional HR firm, and we find ourselves in the middle of the employees and the board, especially if there's an imploding founder. And so I'm really curious how you all view your relationship with the employees of the companies that you support and invest in.
Sure, I can.
Since you're in
I can
you're in
take
the
this.
pits.
I make it a point to get to know the heads of HR at every company that we invest in, or head of operations, just whoever is kind of in that role where the people go to them and they're in the know. Because in my mind, they're your eyes and ears. And actually, I sometimes learn a lot more from the heads of HR than I do the CEOs. And it's not because the CEOs don't necessarily want to tell, but again, because of the power dynamic, they're not always aware of what's going on. So I definitely think it's a conscious effort on behalf of the investor to be available to those relationships and available to those conversations. And actually another example of this is where we have leaders who are trying to build their succession plans, and they're really trying to grow their leadership teams. A great way for them to grow is to give them access to the board, give them access to those relationships. That's a really powerful combo, and it's also just another insight for you on the board.
I so agree with that. As a board member, it's been so helpful to build relationships with each of the VPs and CXOs, because you get a full 360 picture. And this can be a little bit triggering for the founders, but it's really your job to build a bench that's so good they keep you accountable. And the day the company starts to outgrow you, you want the kind of bench that would go to the board and say, hey, we need to up-level the CEO. I know that's really, really scary sounding, but that's almost been most of the cases for the CEO changes that we've had as companies have grown. Because it's hard. The skill sets needed at founding stage are often different than mid-scale versus late stage in public, right? And when you have a killer team, they have a pulse on that. So a lot of times it's even been those CXOs or VPs that have come to the board, and they have a good relationship with the board. They're presenting those sections, and they'll even call it like they see it and say, you know what, our CEO might be better for him or her to shift to chairman at this point.
Yeah, I think also it's a great sign of how conscious that CEO is. I've had CEOs, so what I tend to do is I will say to the CEO, hey, I've got resources. We've got folks that can really help your head of sales, your head of CT, and we start bringing resources in to actually help up-level them. That was Michael Dubin at Dollar Tree. She's like, don't just make me the highest version of myself, make my entire team the highest version of itself. And so with that mandate, we would then bring in resources to try and bring them up. It also means you get to know them, right? And then when the shit hits the fan, you now have multiple ways to look at the picture. CEOs, there are CEOs that then suddenly you start to see them clamping down information flows, and they try and cut things off and please don't talk to my team and whatever. And that's a huge red flag that we have an issue with that CEO at the end of the day. And that means if they're hiding that information, you can only imagine what other information they're hiding. And we lost a company 4 months ago that was worth $250 million, and because of this behavior, Pyle drove it to the ground without telling anyone or letting anyone know, and we had to give it away for zero. And so for me, this is a really hot point, because Darwin will know what's going on, I always say, so let's talk. Anyway, sorry.
You guys you almost teed up my question, so thank you. Almost 10 years ago when I founded my second company, I had this fear of fundraising, and I was like, investors are evil, the whole thing, right? And over the years, I was able to shift that story and raise like the $10 million from amazing investors. Not one person in my cap table, and we had a lot because we raised from a lot of angels. We had 40-something people on the cap table. Not one ever caused any issues. And it wasn't the good times that they were the best for us, it was the hardest times. And Bo was our lead investor, who you know well. And when I had my moment of not thinking I was the right CEO anymore, it was my biggest investors that I called crying before I even talked to my co-founder. And it was the hardest times that those investors were most supportive. And I'm really curious, because I've heard a lot of talk from people in the room who have said, I don't want to raise money. I don't want the baggage that comes with that. And I understand that. And for some companies, that's perfect. I mean, that's like the right answer. Not because of baggage, but because it might not be the right capital. But I'm curious, can you give some examples of when things have gone wrong or hard for the CEOs, for the people in the room who might be questioning, like, if bringing on money is the right thing, and how you've supported them?
Yeah, I can give a couple examples. I don't know how much time we have. I think we might be up on time, so I'm aware of that. But anyhow, yeah, I will say that we've had some pretty dark situations. I know that suicide is something that's come up in the last couple days in conversations, and it's definitely on the mind of many an entrepreneur who has been through a rough patch. And I can think of a specific time, actually a couple of times, where we have been the first people, like your wonderful share, thank you, that someone would call. And that feels really, really good. It's also a ton of responsibility to be that first call. But I think to folks who are wondering, like, should I be investing? Is this a good thing? These are evil people that we always hear about. I think kind of going back to Keith's talk, which is that who's got your back? And if it's a good investor, they're going to have your back. They're not always going to agree with what you want to do and what you say, but they're going to care about you as a person. And when you find people like that, they have your back. If you can't find people like that, I would be hesitant too.
And also just ask, tell me a time where it just went south, as ugly as it could get. How did you show up? And then talk to the entrepreneur and ask the other way. Jerry Colonna has a great twist when I was doing, I need an addiction. I have an addiction to coaching. I have too many certifications at this point. But he said, look, something happens, you miss sales. And the first question is, do you appreciate the magnitude of the miss? Right? I was talking about this earlier. That didn't help anything. He said, why don't you just ask 2 questions? Wow, that seemed like you had a really rough week. How are you doing? And then don't say another word. And then just, I was going to say hold space, Nick, but I'm guessing, what's a better word than hold space? Don't hold space. Don't hold space. Don't hold space, but don't say shit, okay? And then let them just be human, right? I think the thing is that there's a subset of VCs who just don't want to go anywhere near the messiness. They're not going to get to know the management team because they don't want to be the person that everyone comes to. They're not going to want to hold space and get that emotional resonance coming at them, right? So I guess if I can, I think we're out of time. I just wanted to share probably one of the most affirming conversations I've had in years regarding this notion of, can you actually be the best of the best and conscious at the same time? I'm like collecting these stories, so as you have them, please, because I want to be able to share it with all my entrepreneurs. But Conscious Leadership Group did a great piece called The Conscious Killers. It was a blog post probably last month, I think. Definitely worth the watch. And it was about Steph Curry. And he loves his teammates. He loves his fans. He's curious about the game. He comes from above the line. And everyone said, but just don't get in his way if you're down by 3 points with 5 seconds to go, because he's going to crush you. So I thought, oh my God, here's this role model, but I know this is all bullshit, right? This has to be bullshit. And so we held an event, and sure enough, one of the guys brought Draymond Green, who's the below-the-line teammate on the Warriors of Steph, known for kicking people in the balls, hitting them in the head, etc. And I said, Draymond, he can't be this good. Like, this has to be bullshit, right? And I figured Draymond would confirm that because that's his approach. And he goes, let me tell you what happened. We're in the playoffs, end of the 6th game. 2 of the players didn't show up on our team. They just played horrible games. I couldn't sleep. 5 in the morning, I text Steph and I said, fucking Steph, man. The 3 of us, we gotta unionize. We gotta get our level up, like angst, anger. We gotta like find replacements for these guys. We gotta like amp this up. This is really important. We're going to Game 7. And he said, Steph said, no. Everyone's getting on the bus. We're getting them back on the bus. We're getting everyone else on the bus. And he says, more than that, we're gonna have fun tomorrow. And in having fun, we're gonna kick the shit out of them. And sure enough, they had record games, because he brought them back onto the bus, and they absolutely decimated because they got into flow and they were playing with each other back and forth. And he said, and Draymond said, you know what I realized? I came from a place of anxiety and fear below the line. My childhood was horrible. And every week that goes by, Steph pulls me a little closer and a little closer and a little closer above the line. And it's not as exhausting, and I'm playing better basketball. And as a result, I'm going to have a 15-year career. And I thought, holy shit, if that doesn't typify what we're talking about here. So as you think about running your companies, try and pull your teammates above the line. Hell, try and pull your investors above the line, right? And have fun. It's not a drama, okay? So with that, I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank all you guys. And thanks the two of you. I mean, this is just a dream team for me. So